to go further back in time than the 8th century with the Exodus tradition?
I think so, because I think it is not reasonable to suggest that the people at Ajrud, the scribes there, or Hosea and Amos invented the story. This is some sort of a strong tradition that comes from the past. So what to do? How to take the most important step back to the past, perhaps from the beginning of the 8th century. Here again I refer to your teacher Donald Redford, who came up with a very neat idea, I think, and I will refer to it in passing because there's not much here to have in our hands, but he said that perhaps, just perhaps, the very idea of people from Egypt migrating from the Delta, moving from the Delta into Canaan, can be linked to an historical process or events that took place in the Delta in the Middle Bronze Age or in the late Middle Bronze Age. We know from archaeology that Canaanites settled in the Delta in the Middle Bronze Age, starting in the 19th or 18th centuries BC. And they managed even to establish a dynasty in the Delta, ruled by Canaanites, if you wish. And at a certain time, the Egyptians managed to rise with their own dynasty in Upper Egypt in the south, the 18th dynasty, and they took over the Delta from these local people who were Canaanites by origin, and they expelled them. This is the terminology used basically. The expulsion of the Hyksos, because this is known from the writings of the Egyptian Manetho in Hellenistic times, and he refers to these people as Hyksos, which is the corruption of the Egyptian rulers of foreign countries. So just maybe a very vague memory of these events were there in the desert, on the fringe of the desert, and they were collected, so to speak, by the local people and collected by the northerners, the Israelites, who were there active in the desert. But this is not the end of the story, because then we are left with a gap of what, of 8 centuries or 7 centuries between, you know, the expulsion, quote unquote, of the Hyksos from the Delta and the time of Kuntilat Ajrud, Hosea, Amos, and Jeroboam II. What to do? Here I wish to refer back to something that I mentioned already before, the relationship that biblical scholars noted between the figure of Moses and the figure of Jeroboam I. Jeroboam I is strongly related to Egypt, as I mentioned, both in the Masoretic text and in the Septuagint. He ran away in circumstances which are not very clear. We read today the later version of the Jerusalem authors. We have to be very careful there and try to verify that we know really what was there before it was sort of adapted by the Jerusalem authors. There was something there that he ran away to Egypt and he stayed with Sheshonq I according to this tradition, and then he came back. And there are reasons to believe, and we spoke about it in one of our previous conversations, that Sheshonq I, Shishak, could have been instrumental in installing Jeroboam I over the northern kingdom, which means in the rise of the northern kingdom. Now, we don't know for how long the Egyptians managed to control the northern kingdom. Sheshonq, probably yes, and there is even this famous Sheshonq inscription from Megiddo. But for how long, we don't know. Not for a very long period of time, because at the height of the strength of the Omrites, not anymore. But for maybe several decades, 2, 3 decades, perhaps yes. And perhaps on the background of what was the tradition there from the second millennium. And on the background of the connection with Egypt in the time of Jeroboam I, and on the background of a possible liberation from Egypt of the northern kingdom when the power of the pharaohs declined after a while, perhaps there we have the reality to understand the very beginning of the tradition before Hosea, before Amos, before Jeroboam II.
In some ways, the Exodus tradition is the result of a very long relationship between Canaan and Egypt. And yet we also see that during the setting down of the story, the composition, specific details of the 8th century get put into and structure the story. So in your own words, let's summarize the complex history of this tradition.
You're right, Matt. The Exodus story is probably the most complex story in the historiography of ancient Israel. It is the most difficult to decipher fully. It has perhaps the longest history, starting maybe with memories in the second millennium and continuing until after the destruction of Jerusalem, until the Persian period, for many centuries. Now, to summarize, I suppose that we can say that there could have been a memory of events of migration of Asiatics or Canaanites or people from this land, from Canaan, out of the delta in sometimes in the 16th century BC. But it was a vague memory. This vague memory was preserved in the desert on the southern border of Canaan, somewhere there. And then later, there is another layer which has to do with the foundation of the northern kingdom, again with